Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Muslims Facing Tomorrow and Holocaust Education Week, we are delighted to welcome all of you here on this gray morning. Thank you for coming out so early in the morning, and it's a pleasure to see all of you. The first thing I'd like to do is have a moment of silence for the victims of the Pittsburgh synagogue massacre. So just a thought for the victims. The Holocaust was, of course, one of the most tragic events in recent history, in which millions of Jews lost their lives just for being Jews. And the world thought that this was the culmination of anti-Semitism, and the world thought that it would never be repeated again. Today, on November 5th, 2018, as we gather here, we see from the ashes of the Holocaust a re-emergence of the ugly head of anti-Semitism in many forms. We see it in the form of the BDS movement that takes place. We see it in the form of the hateful Al-Quds Day rally that takes place. We see it in the form of Israel Apartheid Week. In my humble opinion, this is because we are unwilling to deal with the root causes of anti-Semitism and are willing to ignore the syllabus of hatred that is taught as a prescribed curriculum of the Iranian regime, of the Saudi schooling, and the Muslim Brotherhood agenda. All of these are happening right in front of us, but we tend to look the other way. At the same time, we are so pleased to call the so-called ring of peace around synagogues that we overlook who these people actually are. Let me share with you who they are in Toronto. They are unindicted co-conspirators in the Holy Land trial. They are supporters of the foaming at the mouth, hate-spouting individuals like Louis Farrakhan and Linda Sarsour. In these very troubling and trying times, the Jewish community needs to be cautious about the alliances that they make. These people will say, of course, that they're against anti-Semitism. They will say, of course, with great conviction, that they love the Jews. But they hate Israel. And that is the core of many of the problems. Only when they accept the right of Israel to exist as an independent country and accept Jerusalem as its capital, should we even begin to have a dialogue with them. Whether it's neo-Nazis or the unholy alliance of Islamists with the extreme left, Pittsburgh will happen again and again, unless we wake up to the reality of the enemy within. I don't have to tell you who that is, but if you need to know, check with us, speak with us. This is our work 24/7. I'm pleased to say that Muslims Facing Tomorrow has partnered with Holocaust Education Week for this very reason. Because we are against the hatred of Israel. We are against anti-Semitism. For the last 3 years, every year we have hosted an event, and many of you have been there. 2 years ago, we showed a film about the Jews, the Muslims who helped with Save the Jews during the World War. Last year, we hosted an event at the Sufi Mosque here in Toronto, where we spoke about the issues, and today we are all gathered here today. And we will continue to do this, not only during Holocaust Education Week, but 365 days of the year. We are aware of where the problem is coming from. We are aware of who the problem makers are, and we will continue to speak out, much to the risk of our lives, but we will never stop speaking out against hatred in any form, no matter where it emanates from, even if it emanates from within our own communities. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. You know, there are some relationships which are difficult to define, and such is the connection of the next speaker to us. Meir is an Arab expert who is visiting Toronto from Israel. You could say he is my adopted Jewish son because he is staying with us, and he's going to share his thoughts with us. Ran?
Shalom לכולם ובוקר טוב. Hello everyone and good morning. My name is Meir. I come from Israel. I'm a guest of Raheel and Suhail. I like to come and visit them, even though it's not always clear to me why they are ready to host me. For me, it's not about Jews, Muslims, Israeli, Pakistani, Canadians. They are just my good friends whom I love to see and visit. Part of the problems between Jews and Muslims, as I see it, is like that we know very well how to divide ourselves. These are ours and theirs, us and them, our holy places and theirs. We've done that for so many years, and where has that gotten us? Especially now, in Holocaust week, Shvua HaShoah, we can see that the hatred and anti-Semitism is still with us. I think it's time we should take things into our own hands. Our next challenge, as I see it, is not with the extremists. They make our lives easy. We know that we can't really talk with them. I think that our real challenge is with the liberals, those who are willing to talk, but usually talk among themselves. Those who believe in coexistence and peace and do really nothing about it. So I think the next mission is not easy at all, but at the same time, it's rather simple. We just need to sit and talk. I think Canada is a very great place to do it, because in Canada, I think you can just start all over again and leave all your luggage behind. There are many Muslims and Jews in Canada, and there are many opportunities to do things together if we choose to do it. During my visit here in the last few days, together with Muslims Face Tomorrow, I had some very interesting encounters. First, I visited the Jihadi mosque, in which I felt a little threatened and not safe at all. But I also visited the Jarahi Sufi mosque, where I felt welcome. They don't ask you who you are or where you came from. They accept you only because you're a human being. I was even able to take part in some of their ceremonies. Also, together with Muslims Face Tomorrow, I went to a Hindu temple and took part in their celebrations. Which other Muslim organization do you know that will enable us to do something like that? Also, I think that if we try and not just talk about it, we can move forward. It's very easy to live our life according to what we see on social media, or what we hear from other people, or what we hear from the media itself. But how many positive things are there that we see from the media? I think we should start with something simple, like have a cup of coffee with someone from the other side. And I believe that Muslims Face Tomorrow can help us enable it. Also, the target is to know the other side, but not enough people are doing that. And I think the more people that will be involved in that, it will encourage others also to do so. Because when you know someone else, someone new, it's easier to have positive emotions and good feelings towards him. And I believe it can turn our lives into much more simple and much more enjoyable. Toda rabba, and thank you.
And now inviting Guido Smit, who is with Holocaust Education Week and also the Executive Director of Muslims Facing Tomorrow.
Thank you. So my name is Guido Smith. I'm a museum educator, a docent at the Holocaust Education Center on Bathurst, just north of Shepherd, and by extension a volunteer for Holocaust Education Week. 4 years ago, I joined a committee which was then headed by Joan Shapiro, who is in the audience, which focuses on outreach to interfaith communities to have events take place in the context of Holocaust Education Week, but not just in Jewish venues. For many, many years there had been events under the heading of HEW with many Christian organizations, but at the time we had not done anything with any Muslim organization. So I made that my mission when I joined that committee, which led wonderfully to discovering Raheel and Raheel, and later on Salim, which has been nothing but an unalloyed pleasure. We've had, this is now our 4th event together, and I'm very grateful to MFT. I'm deeply honored as a Jewish boy born in Israel, raised in Holland, to have been asked to join the Council for Muslims Facing Tomorrow. And the sessions have always been stimulating, fascinating. We've had several references this morning to the re-emergence of anti-Semitism. So clearly the work that we do with HEW is only increasing in importance, not getting any less. So I'm thankful to MFT for participating year after year after year and giving us such stimulating sessions. I think the importance of this get-together is underlined by the fact that the head of the UJA, Adam Minsky, has found the time today to join us. So welcome, Adam. Thank you for being here. Okay. So other than adding the welcome on behalf of HEW to all of you, my job is to introduce the main speaker for this morning, which is Salim Mansur, who has become my very dear friend. Salim is a professor of political science at Western University. He's a well-written and read author. His latest book, The Koran Problem and Islamism, is a fabulous and erudite explanation of what he perceives to be challenges within the Muslim community. We know that there are titanic struggles going on inside the Muslim world, which maybe in principle have nothing to do with the relationship with the Jewish community around the world, but obviously it cannot help but have an impact on those relationships. Nobody is more qualified than Salim is to talk about those struggles and their impact on the relationship between Muslims and Jews. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to Salim, because he has much more interesting things to say. So, welcome, Salim.
Thank you.
Okay.
It always sends shivers down my spine when someone like Guido says, there's no one better than so-and-so to speak, in this case Salim, and then everything after that is a deep slide downwards. Yesterday evening, I'm driving down from where I make my home in London, Ontario. As is always predictable, however, one takes the time to get off early to run into those moments on the road on 401 where you are idling while the traffic doesn't move. And I was stuck, and I called Sohail. I said, Sohail, I don't know whether I'll make it in time, but we'll see. So while I was stuck and idling, I shifted my gear. I have been thinking when Raheel invited me to come and say a few words, take a few minutes on this morning, on this occasion of the Holocaust Educational Week, to blend two things together. As most of you would know, this is also the week that we will commemorate the 100th anniversary of the armistice, which was the end of World War I. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, which will be next Sunday. So initially, I thought about speaking around this moment in time, the 100th anniversary, and reflecting back from where we are today, the 100 years of Jewish-Muslim history, that is modern history, where we have come and what are the problematics. But I decided to change gear because we are speaking in the aftermath of the Pittsburgh massacre. And I want to say right at the outset, you know, a lot of people, in a lot of places, talking about Pittsburgh, both talking about it and writing about it. I've been talking about the great tragedy that happened. It's the worst killing that took place in American modern history of Jews. Player in a house of worship, 11 Jewish worshippers massacred to death by a gunman who walked in. A tragedy. No, I don't say it's a tragedy. I mean, the Jews were there at the wrong place at the wrong time in the sense, you know, what happened. It was a crime. And let's not mince word about it. It was a criminal act of immense proportion that, you know, a man who is not deranged, but whatever virus he was carrying, the virus of anti-Semitism, walked in and deliberately trained his gun on people at prayer. Ruth Weiss, who is possibly one of the most formidable Jewish scholar at Harvard, subsequently wrote in Wall Street Journal about this tragedy, she called it. I call it a crime. And she talked about anti-Semitism in the sense, she said, quote unquote, that anti-Semitism is a mistaken guide to blame Jews for the problems of the world, you know. And then she talks about how it is the most ancient, which we all know, the most ancient bigotry directed against one people. She talks about pagans, Christians, and Muslims that are stained or tainted by this virus of anti-Semitism. Well, I beg to differ a little bit with Ruth. The pagan cultures that were contemporary to the time when Jews entered history as Hebrews in the Bronze Age, those cultures have long crumbled into dust and gone away. You know, Jews are the only people from that Bronze Age as a people defined by a faith tradition, the worship of God of Abraham, is still among us, around us, and thriving, despite all of the visitations of hatred towards them. So this is then not about pagans and Christian and Muslim, it is about Christians and Muslims. This hatred is a phenomena embedded in the psyche of Christians and Muslims. By the way, anti-Semitism is not a Hindu problem. As a Hindu civilization, which is coterminous with the Jews in history, Hinduism is possibly the only living religion that is maybe older than Judaism, you know, because it's also a Bronze Age religion. So anti-Semitism is not a Hindu problem. It's not a Buddhist problem. It's not a Confucian problem. It's not a Shintoist problem. It's not a Zoroastrian problem, even though there are few Zoroastrians still around. It is precisely a Christian and Muslim problem. And so what can we say about this as a Christian and Muslim problem? So I lean back to Freud and Freud's analysis that he presented. Freud barely got out of Vienna in June of 1938 for England to escape the clutches of Hitler and fascism or Nazism. And then he died in September 1939 in England, just 3 weeks after the war against Hitler and Germany began. In this period, between his departure from Vienna and his death in England, Freud wrote a small book called Moses and Monotheism. His friends, his associates, and people all around him begged him not to publish that book because it was a systematic deconstruction not only about what Freud saw the character of Moses, but more importantly, Freud deconstructed in that little book why anti-Semitism, with which he was faced with as a people, why is it embedded in Christianity or in Christians. He didn't speak about Muslims. But ironically, the reason Freud offered for this phenomena of anti-Semitism as the oldest bigotry and the virus that Christians and Christianity has carried is confirmed in the Koran, though he was not a scholar of Islam. But it is confirmed in the Quran of the same problem with the Muslims. So Freud would have been possibly delighted if he was among us. That me, far removed from Freud, am leaning back to Freud to explain why this phenomena is embedded in the psyche, in the mind, in the culture of two people whose faith are also Semitic faith. Freud talks about Judaism as the father religion, Christianity as the son religion. And he only mentions in Moses and Monotheism, in just one paragraph, couple of sentences, that Islam was a return to father religion, and therefore the initial burst of energy by which the Arabs as Muslims swept across in the making of the empire was the energy that came from adopting the father religion. However, the point that Freud made in his argument that anti-Semitism is a Christian phenomenon, and I'm extending it also to the Muslim phenomena, is as follows. He says, the forced conversion, it was coerced conversion of the pagans to Christianity. Jesus, after all, was born to a Jewish mother, grew up in a Jewish milieu, spoke the Jewish language, and for all practical purpose, died a Jew. Christianity evolved subsequent to that, over the centuries, and particularly with the conversion of the Roman emperor to Christianity, to the embrace of Christianity, that's Constantine. The Roman world then turned towards Christianity. And it is this forced conversion that Freud talks about that extended in the development of the Christian religion, pushed the hatred, the resentment, and the loathing of the pagans now as Christians toward the people who, in a sense, are the origin of Christianity. You see? So their paganism was never completely wiped out. It went deep into the unconscious, okay? And that would be reflected in the hatred that was directed against the Jews who were held in contempt, and as we know from historical records, that the Jews were treated with contempt through the millennia, right into our modern time, into the Holocaust, within the Christian world, theologically speaking, apart from all the other consideration. Now, parallel to that is the case of Islam. Islam, return to the father religion, is a Semitic religion. It's the emphasis is on the God of Abraham. In fact, the doctrine, the creed, the Judaic creed is in one sentence. It is a Shema, in Deuteronomy. Hear, O people of Israel, your Lord God is one. Well, the Quran repeats it. This is the verse 112. It's called Surah Ikhlas, or the chapter on sincerity. And it goes as follows. Say, God, He is one. And He is the everlasting refuge. And He has not begotten, nor has He been begotten. And there is none comparable unto Him. So it is almost word by word, sentiment by sentiment, a repetition of the Shema and the tradition, which is the Jewish faith. So what happened? Islam in its birth, Islam in its origin, and Islam in its initial phase is a believer's religion. Those of us who have done the hermeneutics, and in my book on the Quran problem I have alluded to it, the word in the Quran that is emphasized is mu'min, which is a believer, or who is a believer, and iman, that is a believer's faith. And the believer's faith, I just recited it for you. It is almost identical, because God doesn't speak with a forked tongue. So it is identical, it's the same. It is about the worship of the one God, the God of Abraham. All right? And so it was the believer's religion. The word Islam and Muslim is barely mentioned in the Quran. Those of us who do the counting can only find in the Quran roughly about 40 references to the word Islam and Quran. Islam means, in essence, someone who has submitted. And therefore, through submission comes what is a secondary meaning, peace. So a man dives into the water, he submits to the laws of the gravity. He doesn't, strike out and say, I defy gravity. He submits to it, and then he floats, and he's at peace in the water. The man who doesn't do that, he sinks, because he's fighting against the law, right? So submission. And Muslim is simply one who has submitted. It's not a question of believer or of faith. However, a century later, just like Christianity, Islam became a world empire. And the prerogatives of an empire came to play in defining the meaning of Islam and a believer's religion. Jews, who are referred to in the Quran as Ahl al-Kitab, as are the Christian, that is the people of the book. But the Jews are not simply the people of the book, they're the first people of the book. So the reverence or the veneration for the Jews in the Quran is undiluted. In fact, I have said the Quran is a Jewish book because the entire Quran is a reference to Jewish history. All the prophets of the Quran are the prophets of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible. There is no biography of Muhammad in the Quran, but there is ample biographical allusion to Moses, to David, and of course to Jesus. There's chapter headings with that name, okay? So then this is the empire that emerges. like the Roman Empire that emerged, the Roman Christian Empire, the Muslim Empire that emerges, in which it is theopolitics. It is always theopolitics till the coming of the modern age, when politics and religion are separated. Theopolitics is therefore then the politics of those who will seek in their religion the legitimacy and confirmation of their belief system. And in this theopolitics, the Jews, the Christians, and others who do not embrace Islam are then lesser people. And that's the problem. And there is precise word, and I know we are short of time, so I'll run. We are not? Okay. Okay. I have a few minutes more.
Many minutes.
Many minutes, okay. So the Quran then talks about, and this is where the Freudian analysis fits like a glove. There's the verse in the Quran, which is a warning shot given to the Prophet. The Quran, as many of you may or may not know, for Muslims, is the word of God. That is the revelation to one man, that's to Muhammad, okay? So God speaks to Muhammad, or the revelation takes place to Muhammad. And so in this word, the revelation is, God is saying to Muhammad, I won't go through the Arabic, but the English rough translation is, those people who are coming to you to give their fidelity, their loyalty, the wars are over. Muhammad has won the war against the pagans. And now, this is just the last part of his life before his death. All the various tribes of the Arabian Peninsula who have been defeated, therefore who have submitted to the sword, who did not embrace Islam, who fought Muhammad, and Muhammad fought back. Now they are coming to swear their loyalty to him. And the Quran reveals the verse to Muhammad, and it says, those who are coming to give their loyalty to you, beware, for they have only submitted to the sword. They have submitted, but the submission is to the sword. Faith, iman, that's the Arabic word. Faith has not entered their heart. So they are Muslim, they're submitted, they've accepted you because they have no alternative. They have been defeated, and now they accept you. But faith has not entered their heart. When faith enters the heart, there's a transformation. It's not the same person. When you understand that little angels are not pushing the planet, the moon, around the earth, it is the law of gravity. That's the Newtonian law that Newton discovered. Before Newton, it was all the belief that it was the angels pushing the planets around in their orbit. Suddenly, you are a new person. You understand something that can explain not only the planetary movement, it can explain a lot more. So I'm giving a secular explanation of how an idea becomes transformative in the making of an individual and a people, okay? The same pagans who followed Abraham and accepted the God of Abraham were transformed. We're transformed in such a radical manner, in such an ethical manner, that wherever they live, if Ruth Wiss is correct, that the pagan hatred towards the Jews, the explanation is as follows. Wherever they live, and under whatever condition they live, and whatever they would force, compel, or out of the free will they did, they nevertheless did not join those people in the worship of their gods. They didn't turn around to worship all of a sudden Julius Caesar as God, or as Augustus as God, or the pharaohs as God. They were the worshipper of God of Abraham. That means they stood aside when it came to the fundamental matter of who they are. You see? So that's the transformation. And the Quran is saying, faith has not entered your heart. You're not transformed. And that was true. The very people who came and gave loyalty to Muhammad, when his eyes closed, within months and years, they were at war with his family and they wiped out his family. They wiped out his cousin and son-in-law. They wiped out his grandsons. You see, you can only do that if you have no faith. And that's what they did. So when I heard the story of Jamal Khashoggi, I said, well, the Saudis have just lived up to their culture. They're the same people who, did that to Ali and did that to Hassan and Hussein, and that's what they have been doing for 1400 years. You might wear all the garments of faith. You might grow your beard and dress up and go to the mosque and beat your head on the ground and have a little mark over there, and then go to Mecca and slaughter a camel on the pilgrimage and come back as a man, a Muslim, demonstrating how loyal you are. And the Quran says you're loyal because you have only submitted. Faith has never entered your heart. And so that's the psychology. It is made more complex historically because both for Christians and Jews, Jews were held in contempt. Christians and Muslims were the people of two grand civilizations based upon a faith tradition, Christianity and Islam. And Christians and Muslims, as political entities, came into conflict, as always political entities do. And that conflict raged. Jews were apart from that conflict, but they were held in contempt because they were not part, as I said, religiously speaking, that is in terms of theopolitics, part of either the Roman Christian civilization or the Arab Muslim civilization. And then they read, and this is where the Freudian analysis works itself out, and we can give the modern interpretation of it. They read that the Jews are being referred to in the book which is the origin of both Christianity and Islam. There wouldn't be Christianity and there wouldn't be Islam without the Hebrew Bible. It is like a triangle, an isosceles triangle. The apex is the Hebrew Bible. Then, chronologically speaking, it's Christianity and Islam, the New Testament and the Quran. But the Hebrew Bible says, and neither Christianity or Islam, that is neither the New Testament nor the Quran, abrogates the validity and the truth of the Hebrew Bible. In the Quran, all the prophets of the Quran are the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. So what does the Hebrew Bible say? The Hebrew Bible says, for instance, Isaiah says, Jews, you are like a light unto nations. That would become corrupted to chosen people. You are like a light unto nation. You are like a light unto nation. Why? Because you maintain your fidelity to the God of Abraham in the darkest moment of trials of you as a people, whether it was with the pharaohs or whether it is with Hitler. You went to the gas chambers and you still had faith in the God of Abraham. Nothing obliterated that light. So you're a light unto nation. In other words, you are the exemplar. You are the exemplar in what? In terms of faith. And so both Christians and Muslims are full of resentment towards that description. The Jews, you are like a light unto nation. Instead of embracing and finding redemption in that explanation, they turn against it. Why? Again, back to the Quran. Faith never entered your heart. So to conclude, this is a vast subject. It's a fascinating subject, you know. And in modern times, we can go into greater details with analogies and examples of how this plays out and is being played out. For instance, when Louis Farrakhan, my sister Raheel mentioned him, when he says, oh no, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm anti-termite. Or when he says, Judaism is a gutter religion. It's a man without faith trying to pump himself up into something greater than what he is. What he is a loathsome creature. But he twists the meaning of faith. He twists the meaning of Islam, Nation of Islam, you know. So on and on and on example we can give. Khomeini, another prime example of how he corrupted, how he basically abused Islam, which holds the Jews as the people of the book into an anti-Semitic ideology or virus, because anti-Semitism is a virus that is eliminationist, that is annihilationist. It is not simply a hatred, it is eliminationist, annihilationist. And so the European Christians who were pagan, particularly the Germans, who were forcefully converted. If you want to read the best book on this issue, it is Heinrich Hesse's book on Germany, on German philosophy, where he goes into great detail about this conversion. Okay, forcefully converted, whose resentment is what Freud was talking about in Moses and monotheism. And among the Muslims, it's the same. Why are the Pakistanis? Why are the Indonesian, who are not Semitic people, who embrace Islam, but who takes their understanding of Islam from the Arabs, from the Saudis, you know, which is full of whatever minus faith, as the Quran says. There is no faith, you see. So in modern times, just to conclude, anti-Semitism lives on. People either openly want to, under pressure, declare that they're not anti-Semite, or they want to reject it and repudiate it, you know. But deep in the psychology, when you start exploring the issues, it comes out. It comes out in different manifestations. For instance, in the post-1918 period, which is what originally I thought I'd talk about, and I just closed it out. The last 100 years, you see, the expression, the manifestation of anti-Semitism has come in the form of anti-Zionism. And the anti-Zionists in the Middle East have been both Christians and Muslims. Invariably, Christians and Muslims have been anti-Semites. If the Vatican Second Council made a perfunctory apology to the Jews after 2 millenniums of anti-Semitism, it was never complete. It still remains to be completed. But you know, the Vatican was making allowance for the Christian churches of the Middle East who are stained and embedded with anti-Semitism, as are the Muslims. And the only way to deal with this problem from the perspective of a teacher and an educator and in a public discourse is to bring this subconscious and unconscious into the forefront so that we can then excise it. You see, we can talk about it, we can challenge it, and then we can, in a sense, purge it. Thank you.
Are there, everyone's here, yes? Please.
Just in terms of the Koran itself, it has passages that I understand could be construed as being negative towards Jews. I just wanted to know how a liberal or humanistic Muslim approach to teaching children would deal with those passages.
The passages that I quoted, that's not what you have in mind. You have in mind the passages where the Jews are, yeah, correct.
If you see a Jew behind a tree, kill him.
Yeah,
Or a pig, Jews or apes or pigs or something.
right.
How do you teach young children
Yeah.
how to deal with those passages?
Well, let me plug my book, get a copy of it. It's available on Amazon.com, but or Amazon.ca. But very quickly, it's a very large topic, and it demands an understanding of hermeneutics of any sacred text. So the hermeneutics of Quran, the passages where Jews are presented in a negative light are passages where the Jews are in quarrel with Muhammad. And so there is a quarrel taking place. It has to be seen contextually. It has to be seen in a particular sense. It is not a universal statement, because the universal statement in the Quran about Jews and Christians are reflected in the words which I talked about, believers. They're all believers, you see. The Quran makes no distinction in these universal statements, which is, for instance, now I'll give you the verse that is very commonly presented in this English rendition. Those who believe in one God, so who are they? Jews. Those who believe in one God, those who believe in the day of reckoning, and those who do good work have nothing to fear from their Lord. That's a universal statement. Okay, so where there are instances, and there are several instances, where the Jews are presented in a negative light, those are instances, as in the Hebrew Bible, there are situations of conflict and war. The Jews, those particular tribes, for reasons of their own, and then we have to enter then again into history, decided to support the pagans in their war against Muhammad and the Muslim. Quick answer is, these wars that Muhammad fought were, to give you an analogy, the wars Israel have fought in the modern time. Each of the war Israel has fought in the modern time has been a war of survival. If Israel loses, there is no more Israel. Whether it was 1967, 1948, 1973, and so on and so forth. Israel knows a war lost means there is no Israel. So the analogy, a war in which Muhammad is defeated, that's the end of Islam. There would be no Islam. Muhammad would be immediately decapitated. It was an annihilationist war, and the Jews, for political reason, that is those particular Jews, for political reason, decided to join up with the pagans. The question is why, from our point of view, that is now, looking back 1500 years, why would believers in one God, that is the Jews in this particular tribe, not all the Jews by the way, this particular tribe in Medina, why would they make a choice as believers in one God to help the pagan against a prophet who's preaching the message of one God? So that was the conflict, and it is in that context. However, once the Arabs and the Muslims become an empire, that is, I'm talking about the century that followed afterward, their scholars then conveniently obliterated the context and made it a statement of a universal sense. The Jews have been at war with Muhammad, and therefore Jews are the enemies of Islam. And that's what keeps on being repeated even today.
Thank you.
Okay. Jack? You might as well keep that on because you're going to be answering.
Yeah.
Thank you. And
Thank you, Salim. And I want to thank the 401 for the traffic jam, because thanks to that, we've had the benefit of your insight. And also, just coincidentally, I was picking up my copy of Moses and Monotheism the other night, in not anticipation of this. But the challenge, and I just want to ask this and make just one brief comment, is you're dealing with very deep psychological issues, and it's the question we're having is, so how do we even have a dialogue? We've heard from our first speaker around talking to someone for coffee, but when the unconscious motivation, and I like to say, and now what you've done is you've given us the light for the comments I've made around the edges, that the reasons the Christians hate us so much is because the Jews gave them Christianity, and now I know why. And that we're the original Coke, and you're the new Coke, and I try to find common ground. But fundamentally, I think what you're saying is that the fear and the anxiety within the non-Jewish community is that perhaps their faith isn't as strong as it should be because they're not at the top of the apex. And so then, how do you have a dialogue with someone where you're fundamentally, on a theological level, sort of saying, we gave you the light. Ironically, Abraham, who became the first monotheist, was not really accepted as a true religion until you accept the stranger, and that's why bringing the stranger in makes a true religion a religion. When you accept the other, you don't have to be of the same family, but you have to accept. So with that kind of abstract question, I'd love your insight in how we can pull this together to kind of make sense of what you're saying in a practical way, or in a way that I think we've failed in well-meaning communities to combat this anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Jack, don't be too hard upon yourself. It's very difficult to be on the apex, I mean, it was a Lord Disraeli's comment that going up the slippery slope on the pole, remember? But you can't sit over there. So sitting on the apex is a hard act. But the challenge is more pronouncedly for both Christians and Muslims. It is for most Christian and Muslim. Christians are dealing with it. Of course, Christians are, it is the modern world. The modern world is their making. I thought about speaking about the 100th anniversary of the war, and of course it has a whole lot of dimension with Jews and Muslims involved in it. But the war, reflecting back, the Great War, it was called the Great War, 1914-18, and then came the Second World War, and now as time recedes and as we are drifting further and further away, we look back on it, the two wars can merge into one, and it was a massive, massive act of collective suicide by Christendom, that is Europe. And with those two wars, one can point out the age of Europe came to an end. It is simply the rigor mortis that is going on. And the 5 centuries of what constitute the age of Europe, if you want to put it in brackets, you might say roughly the age of Europe began with the age of discovery, Columbus arriving, mistakenly thinking he had discovered the Americas when he was on his way to find a way to India. But anyhow, 1492, that's the beginning of the age of Europe. It is also the Atlantic age. And with the two wars, the Atlantic age and the age of Europe comes to an end. The landmark, iconic names of the last 100 years of history is associated with Atlantic. In World War II, it was the Atlantic Alliance. Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt and the Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie meeting in Newfoundland, creating the Lend-Lease, the basis of what then became the Atlantic Alliance and the Atlantic Charter that led on to becoming the United Nations. It was the Atlantic Age. Okay, but it seemed, in almost a Shakespearean term, it was the last act, and the curtain was coming down. We were not perceiving it, those of us who were born. But now, in the 21st century, we can look back. It is the end. It is the beginning of the Pacific Age, you see. And it is going to be the age of the Chinese, the age of the Indian, the age of the Japanese is there, the age of the Indonesian. And United States is a Pacific power, so it is turning away, you see. So there is something to be said here. One final thought on this matter. There's so many thoughts raging in my head, but one final thought I'd say, those, that is the Christians and Muslims, those who have abused the Jews have suffered, but the abusers have vanished from history. It takes time, but it vanished. The lesson of Hitler, the last great pharaoh to take on the Jews and try to destroy them as a people, you see, well, it was also the end of Germany. Germany was divided. Germany was demolished. And the Third Reich not only went into the garbage can of history, the age of Europe is ended and German power is ended. You see? There is a profound lesson in that. The same thing is awaiting the Iranians and the Muslims. And it's going to happen. It is happening in front of our eyes, but the question is whether we are perceptive enough to see it and discerning enough to understand it and to talk about it. So there's a profound lesson there in this triangular relationship, what I call the golden triangle of the Abrahamic faith.
Let me just put the question here. You don't need the mic, just
The first time I heard you speak was at Hart House several years ago. And I was shocked because you said in the Koran that the Koran, Muhammad wrote that Israel, or the land of the Jewish people, it's not just Israel, belongs to the Jews, and that the God Abraham, which is your prophet too,
it's our prophet. I have no particular exercise on it, but go ahead, sorry.
That's ours. It's all ours. How come Muslims are so against Israel? They should be sued for blaspheming the Quran.
Yeah,
that's always stayed with me since I first heard you at Hard House.
You are 100% right. The Muslims are at war. The Muslims are at war not with the Jews only. The Jews are accidental to this war. They're at war with the Quran, that is with Islam, which goes back to my interpretation of the verse that, you have submitted, but faith never entered your heart, and therefore you are at war with God, to whom you have submitted. You see, it is an unlawful. The Quran is very clear upon the following statement. I mean, these are paradoxes. You see, both the Quran, the New Testament, and the Hebrew Bible, all three claim in its own language that what it manifests itself, is very simple, very elegant, very pure. So, at one dimension, it is very simple, very clean, very pure, because the creedal statement is axiomatic. It is very simple. Hear, O people of Israel, your Lord God is one. It couldn't be any more simpler and purer and clearer than that. The Quranic statement, say, God, He is one, and He is the last refuge, and He has not begotten, nor has He been begotten, and there is none comparable unto Him. Very clear, very simple. But at the same time, it is God. I mean, now imagine, we are collectively, first of all, you have to believe that there is a God. So I'm assuming we all believe that there's a God. God, this massive, infinite idea, is expressing itself or pouring itself to a finite you and me. How do we do that? How do you pour an ocean into a cup? So, what is so simple and clear is also profoundly complex, because the old Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran tells stories. It tells stories to illuminate and educate people through parables. So the fundamental story of the Semitic faith begins with a crime. Think about that. It begins with a crime. That is, crime is embedded in being a human being, that is, being a fallible creature. What is crime? Is not recognizing the truth. What was the crime? The crime was Cain, murder of Abel. Two brothers, siblings. So it's a parable. It is a metaphor. Jews and Muslims are Cain and Abel. Christians and Jews are Cain and Abel. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, whom I just love and adore, and I would recommend all of you to get his book. His most recent book is called Not in God's Name. He tells these stories, and he talks about the Semitic faith. And in his most recent statement, Rabbi Sacks, and I have it in my file, he's giving it in terms of the high holidays, and so his talk was about Jews and Muslims. And he points out, among many things, that Sarah drove Hagar or Hajar away after she bore Isaac. No, Sarah bore Isaac. Hagar had born Ishmael, so Sarah drove Hagar away. That is, forced Abraham to drive him away. It's a long story. Genesis deals with this. But the story circles back to Abraham's death and his burial at Machpelah, Hebron. But at his funeral, this woman appears. And she is referred to in the Hebrew Bible as Keturah. And she is accompanied by Ishmael. And Ishmael and Isaac buries Abraham in Mount Machpelah. So what is the significance of this story? Keturah is none other than Hagar, who reappears at the funeral of Abraham, at his death. And she brings her son, and there is a reconciliation. You see? So, trial and error. That's the book by Chaim Weizmann of his famous autobiography. Trial and error is the manifestation of life. Freud says from error to the ultimate truth. Ultimate truth is a process of discovery through the errors we make in life.
I haven't got time, though.
Right.
Too many errors. No need the mic.
Yeah, she does.
I'm hard to hear.
Oh,
Yeah, Ruthie.
Okay. Thank you. I want to ask Salim about Turkey. You have hope for Iran, Salim. Look at Turkey, which since the 1920s has tried to be a secular country in which head coverings were forbidden. Look at the pictures now of Turkey, Istanbul, not rural Turkey, and see all the people, all the women with their heads covered. In the last 10 years or so under Erdogan, it's fallen back very significantly. I want Iran to be free, as you do. I want the other countries to be free to argue, to dispute, to be imperfect. What do you have to say about a large country right by Europe becoming the way it has become?
Decadence is part of life. We decay. We are so great and beautiful, 16 candles.
Right.
And then we decay. And then we are reborn and we rejuvenated. And then, like Wordsworth, it is blissful to be on that morning when everything happens, So it is a life cycle, There is nothing, if we take simply the Abrahamic faith as the basis, the axiomatic basis of searching for historical answers, then it will always go back to providential, because there's only one absolute, and that is the eternal absolute. Everything else is in a state of flux, and Turkey is in a state of flux.
And
There's a question back there. Yes, please.
Salim, you always give us something interesting to think about. I want to take your words and your how you presented the situation, the problem, and then look at the Jewish community, which is, they are always trying to understand what we can do to stop anti-Semitism. What are we doing wrong? Who are we not being nice to? What can we possibly do? And from your words, it seems that we can't do anything to change things because that change has to come within Christianity and within Islam. That only Muslims can change how they feel and only Christians can change how they feel. But what should Jews do in the meantime? I wasn't surprised about Pittsburgh. I was surprised it hadn't happened sooner, and I won't be surprised if it happens in Toronto. So what should Jews be doing while Christians and Muslims figure things out?
Very important question.
Well, don't blame the father-in-law, and the grandfather of Jews to be the problem at Pittsburgh. We have to be able to identify. So, I mean, yeah, what can we do? I think the Jews are the people who have to and has remain open, because given the situation, Jews are not only at the middle, or Jews are always slipping from the apex. Jews are the one who by number, by the reality, are as fragile as the light in a candle, you know, and they have to keep burning and remain open. So when Sadat traveled to Jerusalem, when he said he'll go to the end of the earth, including Jerusalem, and speak at the Knesset, what did Menachem Begin do? He immediately said, I invite you, we are open. You know, the Jews have never been unopen. You know, their doors have always been open. I think the story of Abraham at Hebron and, you know, his burial at Mount Machpelah, and the coming of Hagar and Ishmael after their journey, and vagaries and all of the problems that they went through, coming back to Hebron and then being welcomed by Isaac and his family and Sarah, is, I think, the metaphor or the symbol of what the Jews, you know, can do, must do, remain doing, because that's what they have done, you know. The Jews have not caused the suffering to others. It is they who have been at the receiving end of the suffering. It is the problem that the Jews, by being true to themselves, invite the resentment, the envy, and the enmity of the others, in this case of Jews, of Muslims and Christians. So I would say, I mean, the role, for instance, right here in Canada, if there is one on a political level to find what the Jews can do, is to know who your friends are and be open to them, and without disclosing who your enemies are, be, you know, prudent and wary about them, you know, and that's what it is. I mean, Canadian political scene is going through a dramatic change. I came to Canada 45 plus years ago, you know, and 45 years later, I see a different Canada. If I tell my story at University of Toronto, and you were there, and we have talked about it, you are University College, I'm University College, you know, there wasn't any Muslims around. And the embrace or the respect for the Jews by the majority community, which is basically the European Caucasian community, after the horrendous experience of what the Jews faced when what was it? King said one Jew is one too many. Remember, when at the most desperate hour of Jewish need, not only Canada but the United States was closed. And then it is the guilt of that led to, you know, the other side of it, and standing with the Jews, you know, at the United Nations. And Canadian history of standing with the Jews at the United Nations is a profound history, you know, that needs to be talked about. And yet, in this 45 years, with the changing nature of immigration and the demography, and we are always guarded and we're trying to be politically correct, but let me blow the political correctness out of the water. It is the numbers of Muslims that have immigrated to Canada as immigrants or as migrants, in this period of the last 40 plus years. Now the Muslim population in Canada is over 3 times the numbers of Jews. And like the weather vane, the political parties in this country has adjusted their political, position accordingly. And Jews are, in that sense, been relegated to a secondary status. We are seeing this happen all along in the GTA and all along the country. So in this context, I think the Jews have to have a frank discussion. This is happening in America with the Democratic Party and the Republican. They have to have a frank discussion, that the various political parties in this country are no longer the political parties of the fathers and the grandfathers. We are in a different situation as Jews, and we have to identify and we have to work and we have to make a relationship with those who fundamentally understand our fundamental nature. It's not a political expedience that we're talking about. We're talking about human relationship out of that. You see, to close this, I constantly remind my student as a political economist and as a historian that politics and economics is downstream of culture, not upstream. And people don't want to talk about culture, because talking about culture is talking about oneself, which is back to Freud. We have to examine ourselves. Thank you.
One more.
This will be the last question.
Excuse me. If we accept the Freudian analysis, I think one could see how modernity in the Western world has failed to overcome anti-Semitism, and we've seen the worst examples of anti-Semitism after modernity reached the Western world. It strikes me that today the Islamic world is struggling to embrace modernity. Are we, well, number one, what do you figure the odds are of modernity winning out? And number two, are we expecting too much from that if we hope that that will overcome anti-Semitism in the Muslim world?
Again, a huge question, but let me just flip over to Freud, for instance. Freud was an atheist. He defined himself as an atheist. He wrote as an atheist. But in the last year of his life, Freud turned in monotheism to talk about Moses. In other words, Freud profoundly understood that while he's an atheist as an individual, he's part of the stream of Jewish culture. He's a cultural Jew, you see. And so there's a conundrum, and that's a paradox. Yes, modernity carries the virus. After all, when I say the age of Europe came to an end, the century that preceded the Great War is the 19th century, the Victorian age. It is the age of Victoria, it is the age of Marx, it is the age of Darwin, it is the age of Freud. Marx, born at the same time as Queen Victoria, 1818, 1819, well, he is a progeny of Jews. What he wrote about the Jewish question in the material term of modernity and held the Jews responsible for all the problems of modernity as the lenders, as the materialists, as the people, the bankers of the world. And so what was a religious resentment and envy towards the Jews in terms of, what Freud talked about, that is the resentment towards God as a pagan who converted through coercion and has remained only in sense of the upper profile, a Christian or a Muslim, but internally in the subconscious is still a pagan. Modernity doesn't wipe that out. Modernity has to deal with that problem. Modernity is a double-edged sword. Modernity gives us the weapon, that is Freud as an example, that he, as a modern person, dug deep into the unconscious. Whether it was the interpretation of dreams or whether it was religion, taboos, sex, he delved into the unconscious as a modern scientist, you know. Modernity gave us that weapon to deal with it, the tools. So as the Muslim world advances into modernity, that will also be the tool available to the Muslim world. And you can see that the Muslim world, from Morocco to Indonesia, which is basically the third world, the underdeveloped world, you know, 90% of the Muslims are living in the non-industrialized part of the world that is seeking to industrialize, moving from an agricultural economy and a peasant economy into a modern industrial economy, you know. This part of the world is also semi-literate or illiterate over 50%. So education is the weapon. I mean, last night when we were at Haifa, you know, I have visited Haifa. I have been at the Rambam Hospital. I've been in Jerusalem. And I see who are the largest clients or customer of the medical service in Israel. It is the Palestinian. It is the Hamas leaders. It is the PLO leaders who go to Israel for their treatment, and then they go back and rage against the Jews. You know, it is a double-edged sword. And I think it is this internal dialectical contradiction from which no individual can escape. We cannot escape. There is a voice that speaks inside of us. So the Palestinian a mother whose child has been saved by Jewish doctors, whatever Linda Sarsour has to say is countermanded by what the doctors in Israel did to save that child, is the internal conflict. And I would put my money that that internal conflict will lead to the resolution of what Keturah represented in coming to Mount Machpelah at the funeral of Abraham.
Thank you.
Thank you, Salim and Guido and Meir for all your input. There is still coffee and samosas and Jewish children there, so please, and you are welcome to socialize and speak to Salim and the other speakers. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. Let's continue this interaction and keep on talking. Thank you.